Bensuguru Pema CD Hong Ong Ahung Bensuguru Pema CD Hong Ong Ahung Bensuguru Pema CD Hong. Hello everyone, welcome to my Sunday Dharma talk here at the Buddhist Center. Today this is the 25th talk in our series on the Digha Nikaya, and today we're discussing the lion's speech in Queen Udumbarika's park, the Udumbarika Sihanada Sutta. The lion's speech in Queen Udumbarika's park. This sutta was spoken at the Vulture's Peak or Hill near Rajagaha in Magadha, which we've also find mentioned in the Great Lion's Roar, Sutta 8, and at the opening of the Mahapara Nibbana Sutta, and also in Sutta 19, which is a Deva Sutta, to use a term that I've coined, a sutta which involves a conversation with a Deva. I'm referring to as a Deva Sutta. We've had 2 or 3 of those in the last few weeks. In Sutta 8, the Buddha is approached by Nigrodha, described as, quote, a certain practitioner of mortification, unquote, who consulted the Buddha about the practice of austerity and was delighted by the Buddha's reply. That's in Sutta 8. The Nigrodha of this sutta is described as a wanderer, and the topic is self-mortification, so it seems likely that the 2 Nigrodhas are the same person. The householder Sandana, or I'm not sure if it's Sandana or Sandana. Let's say Sandana. The householder Sandana came early in the morning to see the Buddha, but discovers that they are in retreat, that is to say, he and his monastics. So he goes to the Udumbarika lodging named after Queen Udumbarika to see Nigrodha instead. He finds Nigrodha in the middle of a large crowd of wanderers, all noisily talking about all manner of topics. We've seen this, not this person, but the situation before as well in a previous sutta. Nigrodha sees Sandana coming in the distance and hushes the wanderers. And just as an incidental aside, we also learn that the lay householder followers of the Buddha wore white. This is something that we see persistently throughout the Pali Canon. So this was the original robe. Nowadays, Buddhists wear different colors, but white for lay followers was apparently the standard in the Pali Canon. Sandana must have heard them anyway, because the first thing he mentions is to point out that the followers of other sects are noisy, whereas the followers of the Buddha are quiet. Nigrodha asks Sandana where the Buddha gets his, quote, lucidity of wisdom, and he suggests rather nastily that his mental sharpness has been compromised by social isolation. Nigrodha suggests that if the Buddha came to the Udumbarika lodging, he would be quickly defeated in argument. Public open-air debates like this seem to have been popular in India. The tradition was preserved in the Tibetan tradition of monastic didacticism. The Buddha descends from Vulture's Peak and walks up and down beside the Sunagada tank in the peacock's feeding ground, possibly an allusion to walking meditation. This must be near the Udumbarika lodging, since Nigrodha catches sight of him. Again, he hushes the wanderers, hoping that the Buddha will join them. When he does come, the hypocrisy of Nigrodha's rather fawning, obsequious friendliness is all the more blatant, since we know what he just said to Sandana. Nigrodha has a question already prepared for the Buddha, and I'll put it in the chat, since it is more or less the theme of the sutta. What is this doctrine in which the Blessed One trains his disciples, and which those disciples whom he has so trained as to benefit from it recognize as their principal support and the perfection of the holy life? Rather than answer the question, the Buddha tells Nigrodha that it is hard for adherents of different views to understand the Dharma of the Buddha. Instead, he asks Nigrodha to tell him, the Buddha, about Nigrodha's doctrine, of extreme austerity. The wanderers make a big stir about the Buddha appearing to turn the tables on Nigroda, something to which the wanderers seem to be prone. Specifically, the Buddha asks him how the conditions of austerity and self-mortification are and are not fulfilled. Nigroda's answer is that they regard the higher austerities as essential. Strangely, he then asks the Buddha another question in return. What constitutes the fulfillment or non-fulfillment of the higher austerities? The Buddha summarizes all of the ascetic practices that we have already reviewed in previous suttas, especially in Sutta 8. Nakedness, non-restraint, non-conformity, not accepting food out of the pot or pan, wearing coarse cloth, shrouds from corpses, or rags from the dust heap, plucking out the hair and beard, sleeping on thorns, sleeping alone in a garment of wet mud. I particularly like that one. Living outside, accepting any seat, abstaining from drinking water, bathing 3 times before evening, etc. Clearly all of these were practiced by ascetics of the Buddha's time, and therefore presumably by the Buddha himself during his years of asceticism, his 6 years of asceticism. The Buddha asks Nigroda if he believes that these practices fulfill the higher austerity, and Nigroda says that they do. The Buddha tells Nigroda that this higher austerity can be faulted in various ways. These faults include self-righteousness, pride, enmity, carelessness, worldliness, jealousy, ostentation, deceitfulness, ill temperament, and extremism, amongst others. Perhaps Nigroda might also like to have competitiveness added to that list, since in essence he is laying a trap for the Buddha, or thinks he is. However, a self-mortifier who does not practice these things is purified. A somewhat surprising statement given the Buddha's views of asceticism, but perhaps he's engaging in his typical intellectual approach to argument, which is to find common ground, and then to proceed from there. Nevertheless, Nigroda sees a self-mortifier purified of these things as having attained the depth and pith of attainment, introducing the metaphor of the heartwood, developed in Sutta 18 of the Majjhima Nikaya. In the latter sutta, the various layers of a tree trunk are identified with different degrees of attainment, culminating in the attainment of the heartwood, corresponding to enlightenment itself. Nigroda thinks that the self-mortifier, purified of the evils listed off by the Buddha, has reached the pith, but the Buddha says he has merely reached the outer bark. Nigroda asks the Buddha to explain how then the self-mortifier penetrates to the pith. How is one to do this? The Buddha says he must practice the fourfold restraint. Those of you who have attended my other talks may remember that from time to time I mention how the 5 precepts, or known as pansil in Pali, namely not to kill, not to steal, not to engage in wrongful sex, not to lie, and not to drink alcohol, the standard 5 precepts that one reads in all the books, often omit the 5th precept, the prohibition on alcohol, quite frequently throughout the Pali Canon, and for no apparent reason. Incidentally, the popular perception that the 5th precept prohibits drugs is inaccurate. I have hypothesized that perhaps the shorter version is original, since it seems more likely that a precept, and the last one at that, would be added on, would be forgotten rather than being added on. Or, I'm sorry, would be added on rather than forgotten. So originally it was 4, and the 5th was added later on. Here we have a name, the fourfold restraint, given to a set of just these 4 precepts: not harming instead of not killing, not stealing, not lying, and not craving sense pleasures instead of not engaging in wrongful sex. Clearly the same structure, slight variation, including three modes: not engaging in the activity, not being the cause of the activity being engaged in by somebody else, and not advocating or defending the activity. I propose that here we see an original fourfold form of Pansil. This furthers the self-mortifier in the upward path. Next, he sits cross-legged in a secluded place, including a tree, a cave or gorge, a charnel ground, a jungle thicket, or in a clearing, quote-unquote, establishing mindfulness before him. We've discussed the etymology of the word mindfulness, Pali sati, in previous talks. In general, I prefer the word attention or attentiveness. We went into this in the talk on the four foundations of mindfulness, especially. Walsh inconsistently interprets mindfulness as mindfulness of the breathing. One abandons all negative thoughts and emotions and practices compassion toward all living beings, the perception of light, and calming the heart-mind, the chitta, which can mean heart or mind. The perception of light refers to a visualization of the body enveloped by light. Even self-identification with the Buddha visualized as a body of light. I've discussed this proto-tantric meditation, which we find elsewhere in the Pali Canon, in my talk on meditation. In Pali, chitta means both heart and mind. Calming the heart and mind suggests what is now called samatha or shamatha, tranquility meditation. Having abandoned the five hindrances of sensory desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, and doubt by these methods, one practices the well-known metta meditation, pervading the four quarters with loving kindness. The Buddha says that one who has followed the path to this point has penetrated to the inner bark. The metta meditation appears to be distinguished in the description which I've just summarized from practicing compassion towards all living beings. Perhaps the latter is more akin to the actual practical generosity of a bodhisattva than to a meditation of a formal type, such as the metta meditation. Elsewhere, the metta meditation is stated to only result in rebirth in the Brahma world, not arhatship. To progress further, the self-mortifier must attain the recollection of past lives. We've discussed this frequently already, and we won't go into that in further detail. The Buddha says that he who has realized this level has penetrated the fibers surrounding the pith. To progress further, he must realize the purified divine eye. Or simply, he must purify the divine eye, which gives him insight into the workings of karma. The Buddha says that such a one has penetrated to the pith. Here we see what appears to be an early attempt to work out the architectonics of the path, consisting of methods and attainments, paths and fruits, based on the ground of the fourfold restraint. And it's similar to other structures which we see elsewhere in the Pali Canon, but it has a primitive quality that suggests that it's an early structure. The Buddha says to Nigroda, quote, "When you ask, what Lord is this doctrine in which the blessed Lord trains his disciples, and which those disciples whom he has so trained as to benefit from it recognize as their principal support and the perfection of the holy life, I say that it is by something more far-reaching excellent that I trained them, through which they recognize as their principal support and the perfection of the holy life." That's quote unquote. This passage, while not entirely clear, based on the reply of the wanderer, seems to mean that the Buddha is saying that his Dharma transcends Nigroda's comprehension. In any case, the assembled wanderers start clamoring again, declaring Nigroda and themselves to be defeated. Sandana mocks Nigroda. "Why don't you battle him," that is the Buddha, "with a single question and knock him over like an empty pot?" Quoting, of course, Nigroda's boast. The irony is delicious. The Buddha chastises Nigroda for not considering the possibility that the Buddha might actually be telling the truth, since he abides in the conditions of true emancipation, implicitly unlike the wanderers in the Udumbarika Park who are so loud and boisterous. Nigroda confesses his fault and the Buddha excuses him. This ritual of public confession or public humiliation was repeated by the monastics at every new and full moon day, called Uposatha, when the monastics would voluntarily admit their faults and execute whatever penance was required by the rules. This was the middle and end of every Indian month, which was a solely lunar calendar. For many transgressions, like drinking alcohol, confession alone was enough. As a transgression, drinking alcohol ranked with tickling, playing in the water, and too frequent bathing. This might surprise some people who are constantly being taught by religious fundamentalists that drinking alcohol is a major transgression. It is, after all, the fifth precept of Pansil. Or is it? The Vinaya itself says that it is not, even for monastics, and it probably was added to the fourfold restraint to make the 5 precepts later in the development of the Pali Canon. The Buddha accepts Nigroda's confession and tells him that he will instruct any man who is intelligent, sincere, honest, and straightforward. You may recall that in a previous sutta, the Buddha spoke how anyone who practices meditation for a minimum of 7 days will either attain arhatship or stream entry within 7 years maximum. This was, of course, in the 4 foundations of mindfulness sutta. Here the Buddha says that if such a man were to practice Dharma for at least 7 days, he will attain, quote, to that unequaled holy life and goal for the sake of which young men of good family go forth from the household life into homelessness, unquote. I'm not aware of any passage that clarifies what the Buddha means exactly by meditating for 7 days. Does he mean meditating for 168? Exactly, Rollo. That's exactly the point I'm making. Does he mean meditating for 168 hours continuously without sleep? This is an altogether more demanding regimen than meditating 18 hours a day, for example. When the Buddha attained nirvana, he remained in trance continuously for 7 days, so the same length of time. Next, the Buddha explicitly repudiates sectarianism. Quote, you may think the ascetic Gautama says this in order to get disciples, but you should not regard it like that. Let him who is your teacher remain your teacher. Or you may think he wants us to abandon our rules. Let your rules remain as they are. Or you may think he wants us to abandon our way of life. But you should not regard it like that. Let your way of life remain as it was. Or you may think he wants to establish us in the doing of things that according to our teaching was wrong and are so considered among us. But you should not regard it like that. Let those things you consider wrong continue to be so considered. Or you may think he wants to draw us away from things that according to our teaching are good and are so considered amongst us. But you should not regard it like that. Let whatever you consider right continue to be so considered. Nigroda, I do not speak for any of these reasons. Unquote. Therefore, the Buddha's Dharma that transcends the Dharma of the wanderers also transcends teachers, rules, ways of life, and ethics. The Buddha's Dharma is not a religion. It is higher and more universal than religion. It is more of a critique of religion, a meta-religion. It is not reducible to historically or geographically contingent categories. And when historically or geographically contingent categories are imposed on it, they lead to the same error as the wanderers, the belief that adherence to external rites, rituals, and dogmatic beliefs are sufficient for emancipation. Rather, the Dharma, the Buddha says, consists of understanding the mechanics of karma by abandoning the taints and cultivating those things that conduce to purification through praxis. Quote, if you practice accordingly, these tainted things will be abandoned, and the things that make for purification will develop and grow, and you will all attain to and dwell in this very life by your own insight and realization in the fullness of perfected wisdom, unquote. Note once again, as I have repeated in previous talks, the identification of perfect wisdom as the essential salvific principle. The wanderers fall silent, but none converts, causing the Buddha to declare them all to be foolish and possessed by Mara, literally causing death, the asura of desirous attachment, who binds us to the cycle of life and death by seducing us with our own desires. Whether the Buddha means this to be taken literally or as a manner of speech, that is, that they are possessed, is uncertain. We're going to be watching for any other references in the Pali Canon to possession, which, as we know, is practiced by some Buddhist sects, especially in Tibet. The Buddha reiterates that emancipation can be attained in as few as 7 days, whereupon he levitates into the air and teleports himself back to Vulture's Peak. Sandana, too, returns to Rajagaha. That concludes my talk. Before we conclude with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings, does anyone have any questions or discussion that they would like to have before we conclude? Next week we'll also be doing, I don't have it handy, but next week, the next Sutta 26 is also a Lion's Roar Sutta. There's several suttas called Lion's Roar, or have the phrase Lion's Roar in the title. So next week we'll be doing Sutta number 26, I believe, which is a Lion's Roar Sutta. I don't recall the precise name. There seem to be no questions, so for now let's conclude with the dedication of merit. Oh, I see a question. That teleporting sounded interesting. Is there any more references or information about that? Not much. There are occasional references in the Pali Canon. Some people like to think of the Pali Canon as pristinely historicist, and references to things like Buddha's radiating resplendent lights and teleportation and levitation are restricted to the Mahayana suttas. That would actually be a mistake. The Pali Canon also includes suttas that involve conversations with devas, aerial light phenomena, teleportation, levitation, and other demonstrations of psychic powers, including telepathy. We need not necessarily commit ourselves to the view that these are historical phenomena. Nonetheless, they are present in the Pali Canon, which is regarded as canonical by the Hinayana sects. So, in fact, we see these kind of archetypal symbolism, if you want to use a more friendly term than mythological references. We see these in the Pali Canon as well as in the Mahayana Suttas. So the Mahayana Suttas are simply following in a tradition established in the during the Pali period. And they're there. They're there in the texts. We see them, we acknowledge them. Any other questions before we conclude? One important thing to realize when discussing Buddhism in the context of psychic powers, miracles, and things like that, to distinguish it from Christianity, for example, is that the Buddhist view of the historicity of these references is fundamentally, from a theological, if you like to use that word, perspective, fundamentally different than in Christianity. In Christianity, the historicism of the Gospels has to be true for Christianity to be valid, because Christianity is based squarely on the miracle of the resurrection and the salvific redemption of humanity by the sacrifice of the precious blood of Jesus Christ, who was God incarnate. So this aspect, this emphasis on historicity, which we find in the Christian tradition, and also in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is relatively unimportant in Buddhism. It doesn't really matter if the Buddha levitated and flew across a river or not. It doesn't really matter if the Buddha perceived the conversations of his disciples telepathically or not. The miracle of Dharma is the miracle of instruction, which is the miracle of that there is a body of knowledge that has the potential capability of leading individuals to emancipation. But whether the Buddha flew across a particular river or not, or levitated to or from Vulture's Peak or not, is completely irrelevant. What's important is the information content of Dharma and not purported miracles of this type. So as the Buddha himself said, these things are unimportant. So we can regard them as sources of information, sources of insight and teaching, without necessarily committing ourselves to their historicity or even being particularly perplexed by the problem of their historicity, since it doesn't really matter one way or the other. Rollo says, so you mean it is less problematic to view Buddhist writings as metaphorical relative to Christianity? Yes, that's what I mean. There's a lot of argumentation in Buddhism about historicity and the historicity of this or that. And this is really, in my opinion, a kind of academic importation from Western theology. It doesn't really matter, the historicity. The entire thing could be a fabrication, and it wouldn't really matter, because what's crucial in Buddhism is the Dharma itself, and not the person of the Buddha or any particular psychic powers that he or anyone else may or may not have had. These things are simply vehicles of teaching, of creating insight. And if they produce insight, then they have value. And if they produce delusion, then they don't have value. And everything has both of these potentials. So it's up to us to appropriate these teachings in such a way that we do not create delusion in ourselves. Whereas in Christianity, it's vital. If Jesus were not an historical individual who did all these things and died and was resurrected, then it's just another teaching, which is not what Christians claim. So we need not get bogged down. My ultimate point, I guess, is we need not get bogged down in the question of the historicity of of this or that teaching of the Buddha. It's not really important. Any other questions? And some Buddhists do get bogged down in these things, which is why I brought that up. Okay, it seems like no one has any additional questions, so let's proceed. Let's conclude with dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive forces come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. I will return next Sunday at 2 p.m. With the next Sutta in our series on the Digha Nikaya. Thank you very much. Namaskar.